Britain's most violent prisoners. Inside Britain's prison system, violence doesn't stop at the gates. It begins there. Behind the walls of Belmarsh, Wakefield, and Frankland, something feral survives. Something that courtrooms and sentences were never designed to contain. Men who dismembered. Men who tortured. Men who look correctional officers in the eye and smile. These are not ordinary criminals. These are the men even other criminals fear. Some entered the system and became its most dangerous inhabitants. Others were already monsters before the metal doors closed behind them. And a few, a disturbing few, got worse inside. Stabbing incidents in British prisons rose by over 40% in a single decade. Riots have torn wings apart. Officers have been hospitalized. Prisoners have been killed. The segregation units, those final isolation chambers, are never empty. Because in the hierarchy of violence that governs life behind bars, there is always someone pushing to the top. You're about to meet 5 of them. Charles Bronson. A man who has spent more time in solitary confinement than almost any human being alive. A man who has taken prison staff hostage, who has waged psychological warfare against the entire British penal system, and who, in a perverse way, has become its most iconic figure. Wayne Couzens. A police officer. A guardian of the law. A man who crossed into darkness so complete that his former colleagues still cannot explain what was hiding behind the badge. Levi Bellfield. Patient. Cunning. A predator who selected his victims with cold deliberation and has continued to torment families from inside his cell, because he can. Ian Huntley. Britain's most hated prisoner. A man so despised that his own survival inside the system has required extraordinary measures. And the violent culture that produced all of them. The prison ecosystem, the hierarchies, the codes, the silent wars, that either brutalizes or breeds the worst of what human beings can become. This is Britain's most violent prisoners. To understand the men inside Britain's maximum security estate, at the top of that hierarchy sit the men who have committed the worst crimes imaginable. The killers. The predators. The ones whose names carry weight even in the darkest corridors. But even among them, some stand apart. Some are feared not for what they did on the outside, but for what they became on the inside. Charles Bronson is the defining example. His birth name is Michael Gordon Peterson. He was born in Luton in 1952. His first conviction came in 1974, armed robbery. The sentence was 7 years. He has never truly been free since. What began as a straightforward, if serious, criminal sentence transformed over 5 decades into something else entirely. Something that has baffled psychologists, fascinated the public, and created a genuinely unique place in British criminal history. Bronson did not enter prison as a monster. He became one there. Or rather, the prison system made him into something it could not control, and that transformation became its own kind of prison. He has been held in over 120 different prisons. He has spent more time in solitary confinement than any other inmate in British penal history. At one point, he spent more than 2.5 decades in isolation, not as punishment for a single incident, but as a continuous, rolling response to a pattern of behavior that the system had no framework to manage. Because Bronson attacks. Not impulsively. Not chaotically. Calculatedly. He plans his assaults. He escalates deliberately. He has taken hostages, prison staff, governors, a fellow inmate, and negotiated with a chilling self-possession that suggests complete control of the situation. In 1994, he took a prison art teacher hostage at Woodhill Prison. He made demands. He did press-ups with the hostage on his back. He then surrendered quietly. The physical capability that underlies this behavior is not myth. Bronson has committed himself to extreme physical conditioning throughout his incarceration. He claims to be able to complete over 1,000 press-ups in under an hour. Prison records document a physique that officers have described as extraordinary, a man who, in conditions of confinement and limited nutrition, has built a body designed for violence. But the physicality is only part of it. What makes Bronson genuinely unsettling is the psychology. He has an acute understanding of power dynamics. He knows exactly how far to push. He knows what will provoke a response and what will not. He has used that knowledge to extend his sentence almost indefinitely, not always deliberately, perhaps, but effectively. His original sentence should have expired long ago. He was released in 1987 and convicted of robbery again within weeks. He was released again in 1992. He was back inside within months. Each return to prison brought new incidents, new charges, new years. He changed his name to Charles Bronson, after the American actor known for violent roles, at the suggestion of a fight promoter who briefly managed a short-lived bare-knuckle boxing career during one of his brief periods of freedom. The name stuck. It became a brand. And Bronson has, in the most darkly ironic way, built a public persona around it. He writes. He draws. He performs spoken-word pieces from his cell. He has attracted celebrity attention, journalists, documentary filmmakers. There is a 2008 feature film about his life, starring Tom Hardy. There is a strange, uncomfortable tension between the art and the violence, between the man who creates and the man who takes hostages. Prison staff who have worked with Bronson over the years describe him in contradictory terms. Some say he can be charming, articulate, even funny. Others describe a hair-trigger unpredictability that never fully goes away. The intelligence is real. The violence is real. The two coexist in a way that makes him genuinely difficult to manage. His parole board hearings have become a recurring media event. He has appeared before the board multiple times. He has presented himself as reformed, as older, as finished with violence. And each time, the question hanging over the room is the same: can you ever truly know? Because the pattern of Charles Bronson, the long decades, the hundreds of incidents, the hostages, the segregation, the press-ups, the art, the folklore, does not suggest a man who changed. It suggests a man who adapted. Who learned to present different faces to different audiences while something beneath remained entirely consistent. As of the time of writing, he remains incarcerated. He is in his 70s. He is still, by any measure, dangerous. And somewhere in the architecture of the British prison system, inside the isolation that created him, he is still there. But Bronson's violence, however extreme, was forged in the institution. It was shaped by the system. The next man we need to talk about brought his darkness from somewhere else entirely. There are crimes that defy the frameworks we use to understand criminal behavior. Cases where the person standing before the court doesn't fit any recognizable pattern. Where the gap between who they appeared to be and what they did is so vast that it produces a kind of cultural vertigo. Wayne Couzens is one of those cases. He joined the Metropolitan Police in 2018. By 2021, he was a serving officer assigned to the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, the unit responsible for guarding the Houses of Parliament. He carried a warrant card. He carried a firearm. He was, in every institutional sense, a guardian. On the 3rd of March 2021, he used that warrant card to abduct Sarah Everard as she walked home through Clapham in South London. He showed her his badge. He falsely arrested her, citing a COVID lockdown violation. He put her in his car. She was 23 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She was walking home. What followed was so brutal, so calculating, and so completely at odds with everything his colleagues, family, and neighbors said about him that the trial felt, in some ways, like an attempt to understand not just a crime but a category failure, the failure of every system designed to detect and stop people like him. He murdered her. He disposed of her remains in Woodland in Kent. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping, rape, and murder. The judge sentenced him to a whole life order. No possibility of parole. Ever. A whole life order in Britain is a precise legal instrument. It means the court has determined that no future circumstance, no rehabilitation, no deterioration in health, no passage of time, could justify release. It is a statement that the crime placed the offender permanently outside the boundaries of any framework of reintegration. Couzens received one. Wayne Couzens, the police officer, the parliamentary guard, the man with the firearm and the badge, will die in prison. His infamy inside the prison system is of a particular kind. He is not feared for violence behind bars. He is despised with a depth that puts his safety in near constant jeopardy. Former and serving police officers are, by the general rule of prison culture, targets. The codes that govern prisoner hierarchies rank cops below almost every other category of offender. They are seen as traitors, not to any noble cause, but to the basic shared identity of those who stand outside the law. To be a police officer who murdered a civilian is to occupy almost the lowest imaginable position in that hierarchy. But Couzens is not simply a bent copper. He is a police officer who used the authority of the state to commit a sex crime. That combination places him in a specific subcategory of prisoner, one that generates not just contempt but active, sustained hostility. Attacks against sex offenders in British prisons are common. Against those whose crimes involve the abuse of official power, they can be relentless. He is housed under conditions that reflect this reality. Protected wing. Restricted movement. The infrastructure of a system trying to keep him alive not out of concern for him, but because the alternative creates its own institutional problems. Prison staff describe managing inmates like Couzens as one of the least rewarding aspects of the job. Not because they are particularly difficult to manage behaviorally, most are not. But because the duty of care that the institution owes to every prisoner regardless of their crime requires officers to protect men they find deeply repugnant from populations that want to harm them. It is a daily ethical exercise in professionalism over instinct. What makes Couzens particularly disturbing, beyond the crime itself, is what emerged about his past during and after the trial. He had previous allegations. Incidents that did not result in charges. A pattern of behavior, the exposure incidents, the use of police authority for inappropriate ends, that, viewed in hindsight, formed a coherent trajectory toward March 2021. The question of how that trajectory went undetected inside an institution specifically designed to vet, monitor, and evaluate its officers, that question has not been fully answered. It may never be. He is now just a number in a system. But his case cast a shadow over British policing that did not dissipate with his sentencing. It raised something most institutions struggle to articulate, that the structures designed to protect people can, in rare but catastrophic cases, become instruments of harm. And that the human beings inside those structures are opaque in ways that background checks and psychological assessments cannot fully illuminate. He will grow old in prison. He will die there. And the name Wayne Couzens will remain, for a generation, synonymous with betrayal at the deepest level. But betrayal is not the same as predation. The next man understood predation in a way that was almost architectural in its deliberateness. Levi Bellfield does not fit the cultural shorthand for a serial killer. He was large and physically imposing. He worked as a will clamper in West London. He was socially functional, he had relationships, children, a presence in his community. To those who encountered him casually, he was perhaps unpleasant, perhaps aggressive, but not obviously extraordinary. That ordinariness was, in retrospect, precisely the problem. Between 2003 and 2004, Bellfield murdered 3 young women. Marcia McDonnell, Kate Sheedy, and Amelie Delagrange. He attacked others who survived. His method was deliberate. He targeted young, blonde women near bus stops in West London, stalking them, striking from behind, and disappearing. The proximity of the crimes to one another, the consistency of the method, should have generated connections sooner. It did not. In 2008, he was convicted of the murders. In 2011, the scope of his crimes expanded in the most devastating way possible. He was convicted of the abduction and murder of Milly Dowler. Milly Dowler was 13 years old. She disappeared while walking home from school in Walton-on-Thames in March 2002. Her murder, and the extended period during which her family did not know what had happened to her, became one of the most emotionally destructive cases in modern British criminal history. The conviction for Milly's murder added a dimension to Bellfield's case that went beyond legal categories. It was the first of his crimes in terms of chronology. It meant that while families grieved, while communities felt unsafe, while police pursued a killer, Bellfield had been present all along, functioning normally, evading detection, and continuing. The word that recurs in accounts of Bellfield, from investigators, from those who knew him, from the psychological assessments, is control. Not the explosive, impulsive violence of someone overwhelmed by rage, but a patient, strategic assertion of power over the most vulnerable people he could identify. Inside prison, this manifests differently. Bellfield is not a fighter. He is not Bronson, testing the system with physical confrontations. His danger is of a different order. He talks. He contacts families. He offers information about their loved ones, information only he could possess, and then uses it. He provided details about Milly Dowler's final hours to her parents during his second trial, ostensibly cooperating, actually controlling. He reportedly offered to reveal where he had buried evidence of further crimes in exchange for privileges. Each of these acts demonstrates the same underlying architecture, the identification of what someone needs desperately, and the placement of himself between them and that thing. It is manipulation at its most clinical. His reputation on the wing where he is held is peculiar. He is not liked. He is not trusted. But he is, in a way that few prisoners are, feared for his mind rather than his body. Other inmates understand that proximity to Bellfield carries risk, not physical risk, but the risk of being used, maneuvered, implicated in something. He generates a social force field of wariness. He has continued, from inside prison, to claim knowledge of unsolved crimes. Whether those claims are real or fabricated as leverage has never been fully established. But the claims exist. And that ambiguity is precisely the point. As long as there is uncertainty, as long as families might believe he knows something, he retains power. It is a form of ongoing violence. Invisible, legal, and almost impossible to stop. Prison officers who have worked on his wing over the years describe a man who never stops calculating. Who watches. Who files away information. Who is, behind the passive exterior, always working out what everyone around him needs and how to use it. That quality, that relentless, patient calculation, is in some ways more disturbing than anything Bronson has ever done in a prison yard. Because it has no segregation unit. It cannot be locked away in a special cell. It lives quietly in the mind of the man behind the door, and it does not stop. He will never be released. He too has a whole life order. Like Couzens, the court determined that the crimes placed him permanently beyond the reach of rehabilitation frameworks. But he is alive. He is active. And in the strange, limited theater of the prison wing, he continues. And somewhere near him, in the same institutional ecosystem, there is a man whose name generates a visceral, immediate response in almost every British person who hears it. There are criminals whose names become shorthand. Whose crimes embed themselves in the cultural memory of an entire country. Ian Huntley is one of them. In August 2002, 10-year-old Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman disappeared from Soham in Cambridgeshire. They had been to a neighbor's house, a man named Ian Huntley, who was the caretaker at Soham Village College. His girlfriend, Maxine Carr, was a teaching assistant who knew the girls from school. For 13 days, the nation searched. Huntley appeared on television. He spoke about the girls with apparent concern. He gave interviews. The performative aspect of his behavior during that period, the calculated positioning of himself within the investigation rather than away from it, would later become central to understanding how he operated. The girls were dead from the night they disappeared. He had killed them inside his house. Their bodies were found in a ditch near RAF Lakenheath. His conviction in 2003 generated a national response of a particular quality. Not just grief, which was there, but something closer to a collective revulsion, a sense that the specific betrayal involved, the neighbor, the caretaker, the familiar face, had violated something fundamental about the social contract. He received 2 life sentences with a minimum tariff of 40 years. Inside prison, Ian Huntley occupies an extreme position. Child killers are, within the prisoner hierarchy, at the very bottom. They are targets. They are attacked. They are, in many cases, placed on vulnerable prisoner wings simply to keep them alive. Huntley has been attacked multiple times. In 2005, his throat was slashed with a razor in Wakefield prison. He survived. In 2010, he was attacked again, bleach poured into his food. Again, he survived. The attacks are not random. They are, in a grimly coherent way, expressions of the same moral hierarchy that governs broader public feeling about his crime. Prison populations contain people who have committed serious violence, serious harm, but who retain, in many cases, a code around children. An attack on Ian Huntley is, within that code, not simply aggression. It is enforcement. The prison system's response to this dynamic is to protect him. Not for his sake. No one in the institution is under any illusion about the scale of his crimes, but because the institution is legally and ethically required to provide a duty of care. The state sentences people to prison. It does not sentence them to death by fellow prisoner. The distinction matters, even when the enforcement of that distinction is deeply uncomfortable. He has been moved repeatedly. The nature of his notoriety means that wherever he is placed, within the general population, his presence becomes destabilizing. Other inmates want to harm him. Officers have to manage that tension continuously. The resource cost of keeping Huntley alive in a mainstream prison environment is, by any measure, significant. What emerged in the years after his conviction added layers to an already complex picture. Details about his history, the pattern of relationships with young girls, the prior allegations that had not been pursued, suggested that Soham was not an aberration but a culmination. That the road to August 2002 had been long and visible to those who had known him across different contexts. The Bichard inquiry, which followed the investigation, found systemic failures in how police intelligence about Huntley had been shared and retained. The inquiry produced significant changes to how criminal records are managed, how information flows between forces, how background checks for those working with children are conducted. In this very specific, very painful way, the deaths of Holly and Jessica changed the institutional infrastructure of child protection in Britain. Those changes carry their names. That is a complicated legacy to sit alongside the horror of how it came to be. Huntley continues to serve his sentence. He has attempted suicide multiple times. The institution continues to manage those attempts, because again, the duty of care does not have exceptions. He will not be released for decades, if ever. And his name, when spoken in a British prison, produces a reaction that is immediate and unmistakable. He is not the only one. He is not the last one. The men we have discussed so far span a range: the institutionally violent, the authoritative predator, the calculated manipulator, the reviled killer. But to understand what Britain's most dangerous prisoners represent, we need to step back and look at the system that holds them all. Category A status is not a fixed designation. It can be reviewed. It can be upgraded or downgraded based on behavior, intelligence assessments, and changing risk calculations. The process is managed by the Directorate of High Security, a unit within His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service specifically responsible for the management of the highest risk offenders. There are, at any given time, roughly 250 prisoners on Category A status in England and Wales. That figure represents an extraordinary concentration of danger. Serial killers, terrorists, organized crime figures at the highest level, gang leaders whose reach extends beyond the walls, former police officers, former soldiers, people whose crimes are so recent that they are still processing what happened, people whose crimes are so old that they have become, inside the institution, something resembling familiar. Managing this population requires a specific kind of officer. The training for high-security prison work goes beyond what standard prison officer training involves. De-escalation techniques, psychological profiling, awareness of manipulation and grooming tactics, not as they apply to the outside world, but as they apply within the institution itself. Because the men in Category A facilities are often intelligent, experienced, and have had years to study the people managing them. There are documented cases of prisoners in high-security conditions who have cultivated relationships with staff over months or years, building apparent trust, before attempting to leverage that trust for unauthorized information, contraband access, or intelligence about the institution's security arrangements. The gray zones are constant. An officer who develops rapport with a difficult prisoner is doing their job. An officer who allows that rapport to cross into genuine personal relationship has created a vulnerability. The line between those two things is not always obvious in real time. And the pressure of working in these environments, the daily proximity to people whose crimes are extraordinary, the physical confinement, the noise, the unending management of violence and threat and manipulation, extracts a toll. Officer mental health in high-security prisons is a documented concern. Burnout rates are significant. The job requires people to sustain, indefinitely, a professional equanimity in conditions that are intrinsically dehumanizing. There have been riots. The most significant in recent British history occurred at HMP Strangeways in Manchester in 1990. 25 days. Prisoners on the roof. 1 prisoner killed. Over 100 injured. Damage that required the prison to be substantially rebuilt. The Wolf Report that followed the Strangeways riot shaped prison policy for a generation. But Strangeways was not unique in its causes. The overcrowding, the degraded conditions, the limited purposeful activity, the sense of invisible and arbitrary authority, these are not historical problems. They remain present in the British prison estate. The violence that erupts in less dramatic incidents, the stabbing in a corridor, the assault in the exercise yard, the riot in a single wing, is the ongoing expression of those conditions. It does not generate reports. It does not change policy. It becomes, over time, simply the ambient noise of incarceration. For the prisoners at the top of the hierarchy, the Category A inmates, the whole-lifers, the men who know they will die behind these walls, that ambient violence is context rather than exception. Some manage it through the kind of calculated control that characterizes Bellfield. Others through the institutional pugilism of Bronson. Others simply endure. Find routines. Find corners of the system that are quieter. But the violence never fully stops. And occasionally it produces something that makes the news. An incident that breaches the wall of institutional invisibility and arrives in the public consciousness as a story, a headline, a cause for concern. Those incidents are rarely the whole story. They are fragments of a continuous narrative that takes place behind locked doors, in corridors that smell of industrial cleaning fluid and confined bodies, under lights that flatten everything to the same pallid gray. The segregation unit is a distinct architecture within the architecture of the prison. In every high-security facility, there is a section reserved for prisoners who cannot be managed within the general population. Some are placed there for their own protection, like Huntley, like Couzens. Others are placed there as punishment for serious assaults, for possession of weapons, for targeting staff. Others are placed there because they have become so destabilizing to the wing environment that no other option remains. Bronson has spent most of his adult life in segregation units. Not in one facility, but across more than 100, as transfers attempted to reset patterns that never reset. The segregation experience is, by clinical definition, psychologically damaging. Extended solitary confinement, defined by international standards as more than 15 consecutive days, produces measurable effects. Anxiety, perceptual distortions, difficulty regulating emotion, difficulty with social interaction. Paradoxically, the responses that make someone more difficult to manage in a normal wing can be exacerbated by the very isolation used to manage them. This is one of the central contradictions of the British high-security estate. The tools available to manage extreme violence, segregation, transfer, isolation, can, in sufficient quantity and duration, produce more of what they were designed to contain. The prisoners who emerge from long segregation periods are often worse, not better. More reactive. More suspicious. More attuned to perceived slights and threats. Less able to navigate the ordinary social frictions of wing life without escalation. The system knows this. Reports have documented it. Inquiries have recommended alternatives, graduated approaches, better mental health intervention, more purposeful activity within segregation units. Implementation has been patchy at best. Because the institution faces a structural problem, the resources required to provide better, more nuanced management of the most dangerous prisoners are expensive, require training that takes time, and produce results that are difficult to measure and politically unrewarding. Reducing reoffending inside prison does not generate headlines. Preventing a riot does not generate headlines. Managing Charles Bronson through the development of a complex, individualized approach to his psychological needs rather than simply locking him in a smaller box, that does not generate headlines either. What generates headlines is failure. An escape. A murder on a wing. A hostage incident. A riot. And so the institutions are, in some ways, optimized for the absence of newsworthy failure rather than for the achievement of anything more ambitious. The men inside those institutions are shaped by that optimization in ways that have never been fully reckoned with. Beyond the individual prisoners, beyond Bronson and Couzens, Bellfield and Huntley, there is a category of violence inside British prisons that exists at the organizational level. Gangs. The gang presence in the British prison estate is extensive, structured, and deeply embedded. Street gangs from London, Manchester, Birmingham, and other major cities do not dissolve when their members are incarcerated. They transfer. The same hierarchies, the same affiliations, the same conflicts, move inside. The economics of this presence are significant. Prison drug markets, primarily synthetic cannabinoids, heroin, and increasingly, prescription medications, generate substantial revenue. That revenue buys power. Power buys protection. Protection buys loyalty. The men at the top of these internal economies are not always the most violent. Some are not violent at all in the conventional sense. They are managers. They are men who understand supply chains and have adapted those skills to an environment where every resource is constrained. They are also, frequently, the people who instruct violence rather than perform it. A stabbing in a prison corridor may be carried out by someone 3 levels down from the person who ordered it. That person may be in a different facility, communicating through a network of trusted intermediaries, never coming close to the direct act. Managing this requires intelligence work that blurs the boundary between prison management and active policing. Officers in high-security facilities work alongside intelligence services whose function is specifically to map these networks, identify the decision points, and develop strategies to disrupt them. It rarely results in anything as clean as a dismantlement. The network is resilient. When a node is removed, a key figure transferred, a communication channel blocked, the network adapts. The economics are too compelling for it to simply stop. The violence that emerges from these economies is distinct in character from the impulsive violence of someone like Bronson, or the predatory violence of someone like Bellfield. It is instrumental. It is a message. It is enforcement of contracts in an environment where no legitimate enforcement mechanism exists. A debt unpaid. A dealing territory infringed. An instruction refused. These are the precipitating events for a significant proportion of the violence that occurs inside British prisons that never makes the outside news. And among the prisoners caught in this ecosystem, who may not be gang members themselves, who may simply be in proximity to those who are, the constant navigation of threat is a defining feature of daily life. The sentence handed down in court is one thing. The reality of serving that sentence inside this environment is another entirely. For some, the gap between those two things is the most important and least understood aspect of what imprisonment in Britain actually means. Let us talk about unpredictability. In psychological assessments of dangerous offenders, unpredictability is a specific risk factor. It is distinct from general violence risk. A man who is violent but predictable can, in some ways, be managed. His patterns can be identified. His triggers can be mapped. Protocols can be designed around them. A man who is unpredictable is fundamentally harder to contain. Bronson, paradoxically, is in some ways predictable. His patterns of escalation, his response to certain stimuli, his relationship with attention and visibility, these have been documented over decades. He is dangerous, but not opaque. Others are more obscure. The British prison system holds men who have committed single acts of catastrophic violence with no prior history and no clear psychological framework to predict them. Men who, in any risk assessment, would score low until the moment they do not. This is a genuine problem for prison management. The allocation of resources, the extra supervision, the intelligence focus, the specialist intervention, is driven by risk scores. Risk scores are driven by history. Men with no history of prison violence, regardless of the severity of their original crime, tend to score low. And some of them are not low risk. There have been attacks inside British high-security prisons carried out by men whose institutional behavior had given no warning. Attacks on staff that resulted in serious injuries. Attacks on other prisoners that came without prelude, without the usual social signals that an experienced officer might have read. The question of how to prepare for these cases, how to allocate resources towards something that, by definition, has not yet revealed itself, is one the prison service has never satisfactorily resolved. Because there is no satisfactory resolution. There is only the management of probability. And probability, when the population involved is large enough and the duration is long enough, guarantees that some of those low-probability events will occur. The corridors of Belmarsh and Wakefield have seen them. The hospitals that treat the results are more familiar with prison-related injuries than the public generally realizes. There is a question that recurs in discussions of the most violent prisoners: what do we want from their imprisonment? It is not a simple question. For some crimes, for Couzens, for Bellfield, for Huntley, the whole life order has answered it at the institutional level. Society, through the courts, has determined that rehabilitation is not the purpose. The purpose is permanent separation. The life inside the walls is the sentence. For others, the question remains live. For the thousands of Category A and B prisoners whose release remains a future possibility, the answer to what imprisonment is for shapes everything: the programs offered, the progression routes available, the parole criteria applied. The British system commits, in its official documents and stated values, to rehabilitation as a core purpose of imprisonment. It affirms that even serious offenders retain the capacity for change and that preparing them for a life without reoffending is an institutional responsibility. The reality inside the estate is that rehabilitation programs are chronically under-resourced, inconsistently applied, and frequently disrupted by the same overcrowding and violence that characterizes the broader institutional environment. A prisoner who genuinely wants to engage with offending behavior programs may wait months or years for a place. A prisoner whose psychological needs require specialist intervention may not receive it. The gap between the stated values and the operational reality is significant. It produces outcomes that the system itself would, if fully rational, want to prevent. People who leave prison with untreated mental illness. People who leave without the vocational skills or housing stability that reduce reoffending risk. People who have spent years in environments that trained them in the dynamics of violence, predation, and manipulation without providing any counter-narrative. The Bronson case is, in this sense, a microcosm of a systemic failure. Whatever the original character of Michael Gordon Peterson, whatever trajectory he might have taken in a different system, with different interventions, the British prison system produced Charles Bronson. Not through malice. Not through intent. But through the accumulated effect of decades of segregation, transfer, and institutional response to violence that generated more violence. That is not an argument for Bronson's release. It is not an argument for sympathy. It is an observation about systems, and about what happens when systems produce outcomes they are designed to prevent. The hierarchy at the top of Britain's prison violence landscape does not stay static. Names fall from prominence, through death, through transfer, through the slow erosion of institutional memory. New names emerge. In the years since the cases we have discussed became public, the population of Britain's most dangerous prisoners has continued to evolve. New convictions. New whole life orders. New cases that shocked the country and then were absorbed into the permanent record of the worst things people have done to each other. The system continues. The Category A wings are never empty. The segregation units are never fully quiet. The intelligence units never stop mapping the gang networks. The parole boards never stop asking questions that may not have answers. And somewhere behind the metal doors and the fluorescent lights and the echoing corridors, the men we have discussed today continue to exist. Continue to age. Continue to define, in their different ways, what it means to be at the extreme edge of the institution that Britain uses to manage its most dangerous people. Bronson with his art and his mythology and his press-ups. Couzens with the weight of what he was and what he did. Bellfield calculating, always calculating, from behind the door. Huntley surviving, somehow, in a system that protects him from the consequences of being who he is. These are not redemption stories. They are not cautionary tales in the conventional sense, tidy narratives with clear lessons and clean endings. They are something messier and more honest, records of what human beings are capable of, and of what the institutions built to contain that capability look like from the inside. The sentence is handed down in the clean formality of a courtroom. The wig, the gown, the measured language of the law. And then the door closes. And the real sentence begins. Inside Britain's prisons, that sentence is just the beginning. The men we have looked at tonight represent the outer edge of a system that holds over 80,000 people. Most of those people will be released. Most will attempt to rebuild something. The question of what they rebuild, and what they bring with them when they do, is not answered by what happens in the courtroom. It is answered by what happens in the years of concrete and locked doors and fluorescent light that follow. The most violent prisoners in Britain are, in a very specific sense, the system's most visible failures. They are the cases where every intervention, every management strategy, every institutional response has been insufficient to the scale of what they represent. But they are not anomalies. They are the far end of a distribution that begins somewhere much more ordinary. In overcrowded local prisons. In inadequate mental health provision. In the absence of purposeful activity and genuine rehabilitation programming. In the accumulated small failures of an underfunded, overstretched system that was asked to do too much with too little for too long. The monster at the end of the corridor is not the only problem. It is just the most visible one. Which prisoner should we cover next? Let us know in the comments, because in the British criminal justice system, there is never a shortage of stories that demand to be told.